Sidney Smith was very interested in economic and social history and made a generous donation from him and also from his friends to the Department of Economic and Social History when it was founded in 1971. Indeed, it's reputed that one of the lecturers, Mike Brown, their family dog Sid, was named after Alderman Sidney Smith. Through him, an endowment was reached, which we're still benefiting from today, where we were able to initiate first of all lectures up until the in the 70s, up to the early 80s, in the Department of Economic and Social History, including some of the great names of that day, names to conjure with like Edward Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and people like that. In recent times, the lecture was reinstated after the Wilberforce Institute was founded in 2006. And since then, we've had a number of extremely distinguished lecturers from around the world, starting with Seymour Drescher in 2010, people like Catherine Hall, Philip Morgan, Vereen Shepherd, Jean Lane, and last year, our director, John Oldfield. We followed our previous director, David Richardson, both in giving lectures as part of the Sidney Smith, Alderman Sidney Smith lecture. So this is a great event for us. It's a very important event for us. It honours the Alderman Sidney Smith, but it also allows an audience both here and for the first time online, so we very much want to welcome the people who are online at the moment to hear the top research by leading scholars into issues to do with slavery and abolition. And I'd like now to introduce Jenny McLeod, who is the head of the Department of History, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Jenny.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Doug Hamilton, who hails from Inverness and was educated at Aberdeen University. He started his career as a curator at the National Maritime Museum, and then he joined Hull University on an auspicious day, because it was the same day that I started here too. He worked here from 2006 to 2014, then he moved on to Winchester and then Sheffield Hallam University. Doug's published widely on the 18th century history of the British Atlantic Empire, especially in relation to the Caribbean and slavery. His most recent book was with John McAleer. It's a companion volume in the prestigious Oxford History of the British Empire series. That book was published this summer. It's called Islands in the British Empire in the Age of Sail. He has written other books on Scotland and the Caribbean, on slavery, memory and identity, and on Jacobitism and the Empire. His two current projects are an AHRC-funded project on the Empire of Islands, and also on the role of the Royal Navy in the 18th century Caribbean. And it's from that work that he draws this lecture. His talk today for the Alderman Sidney Smith lecture is called Enslaved Revolt and the Royal Navy in the Caribbean, 1790 to 1832.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back here amongst friends at the Wilberforce Institute, and even more so to be here in person, talking to actual people. But it's also great that so many people are able to join online and further afield. I'm grateful to Jenny for her kind words, and to Trevor and to the Institute for inviting me to join the list of distinguished speakers who have given this lecture in the past. I confess it's a little daunting to be following E.P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm. Am I in shot?
I don't know, good. Just ignore me.
Some questions I never thought I'd ask giving a lecture. I was here in the audience when the series resumed in 2010, and so having attended several of them in the interim, I'm kind of fully conscious of the standards that have been set. So what I want to do today is talk to you about the self-liberation struggles of the enslaved populations of the Caribbean, and to think about the role of the Royal Navy in suppressing them. I'm going to concentrate particularly on Phelan's rebellion in Grenada in 1795, and the Jamaican Rebellion, also known as the Baptist War or the Christmas Rising, in 1831-32. The role of the Royal Navy as an instrument of the state in suppressing revolt has, until relatively recently, received little attention. In some ways, this is unsurprising. Uprisings by the enslaved took place on land, while the Navy operated as a maritime force. Yet in virtually every major uprising in the British Caribbean in the so-called Age of Abolition, the Royal Navy was instrumental in securing victory for the colonial elite. So to help us think about the importance of the Navy, and indeed of the sea for the enslaved too, I'm going to start by asking you to think about, we have a tendency as historians to think of enslaved societies and enslaved communities as land-based. We also, although there are now some notable exceptions, generally confine our analyses of the Caribbean to specific island colonies, bounded and delineated by the sea and by different imperial powers. There we are. Caribbean's maritime colony. Nonetheless, as Julius Scott, Tessa Murphy, and others have reminded us recently, the sea connects the Caribbean, and it turns it from a jumble of separate islands into an interlinked archipelago, in which experiences both enslaved and free were entangled. So Pocock's painting here, which you can see on the one back, it's important for helping us to think about the range of connections between Caribbean islands. We often think of Caribbean shipping and Caribbean trade as being the great transatlantic crossings, but what Pocock is depicting here is the multitude of small craft plying trade and raising communications between Caribbean islands. These craft, these vessels, created communication routes around the Great Arc of the Caribbean. Now, this kind of movement wasn't a European invention, of course. Indigenous island Caribs used small craft to traverse the short crossings between islands long before Columbus's ships loomed over the horizon. These populations were devastated by European invasions, but they and their knowledge of the seas survived into the 18th century, particularly in the southern Caribbean, with which we're going to be concerned for part of this afternoon. Their presence and their skills were acknowledged in accounts of the islands. Can I have the next slide, please? In this case, enlivened 17th century true and exact history of Barbados. And I'm drawing your attention here. The pointer might work even with the clicker. The slide doesn't. No, that's not working either. Okay. So I'm just going to draw your attention to this figure here, who Lyman calls Sally Mingo, and his 35-foot canoe. So there's evidence that's recognisable by Europeans of indigenous trade and communication around the Caribbean. And into the 1790s, there's evidence of the Navy intercepting indigenous canoes, carrying weapons between rival colonies. Is it working? Thank you. This kind of vessel was used not only to connect islands, but to travel around them. As late as the 1820s, the commentator Charles Shepherd noted that it was better to travel around St. Vincent than to traverse it. He wrote that passage by sea in canoes being more easy and commodious. Just as island Carib practice remained significant into the Age of Abolition, so too did African practice, African knowledge of the sea. As Jenny said, I was once a curator at the National Maritime Museum many years ago, and I was once asked by a member of the public to justify the museum's 1807 bicentenary programs coming up to 2007. What, he wanted to know, was so maritime about the transatlantic slave trade? And apart from the bleeding obvious, African seafaring, part of what Kevin Dawson calls aquatic culture, is important too. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a watercolour painted by Lieutenant Gabriel Bray on board HMS Pallas off West Africa in 1775. And Europeans often foundered in the difficult waters off the African coast, and as in this case, relied on African specialists to connect ocean-going ships to the shore. And some Africans took their seafaring knowledge with them through the slave trade to the Caribbean. Now, there's a growing and increasingly important literature on that it explores the maritime world of the enslaved, of ships' pilots in Caribbean harbours, of the kind of intra-island trading undertaken by people of colour, free and enslaved, described by people like Michael Jarvis and depicted, as we saw, in Pocock's watercolour. We also know more about the maritime occupations of the enslaved, in harbours and in dockyards, and extraordinarily perhaps, as fishermen who were able to go to sea and return to shore. Can I have the next slide as well? So this is a painting from 1834, and our focus is not so much on the schooner, which is what concerned the artist, but on the two figures in the rowing boat in the foreground. Given the date of 1834, it's likely that these two men were either free or had been recently apprenticed. But they represent fishing and turtling as acceptable roles for the enslaved, outlined, for example, for the Virgin Islands by Anne Hill Smith, once of this parish. So my first point then is that our understanding of the Caribbean needs an awareness of the seas as well as of the land. Not least because the sea offered relief and escape from enslavement, but for pilots temporarily in control of ships of the line, or fishermen freed for a few hours from the constant abuses ashore, maritime activity represents a different kind of enslavement. But it also, of course, offered a means of resistance. Processes of maritime marronage, in which enslaved people use their maritime knowledge and opportunities to escape their enslavement, have been outlined in some detail in the scholarship. As we'll see, the ability of the enslaved to move between islands was not only about marronage, it also helped facilitate revolt. Now, this sense of the sea as a means of liberation has been taken up by naval historians. Can I have the next slide, please? Nicholas Pocock, whose image of the Piton we saw a moment ago, was a prominent maritime artist who was much better known for this kind of epic battle scene, the Battle of the Saints, in 1782. And it looks a lot like his depictions of other big set-piece naval battles like the Battle of Trafalgar. And in this kind of view, the role of the Navy in the Caribbean in protecting shipping and protecting colonies was really a kind of extension of the struggle between the great European powers of Britain and Spain. The figures on the right here give you some kind of sense of the scale of the operation. So these are the two British naval dockyards in the Caribbean in 1782, right at the tail end of the American War of Independence. Between them, there were over 100 ships and over 35,000 men stationed in the Caribbean. In other words, the Royal Navy had deployed at least a quarter of its entire fleet to the protection of the Caribbean. But I want to suggest that the role of the Navy is more important than that. It's wider than that. Because the role is not just about a kind of extension of the great power struggles of Europe into Caribbean waters. The Caribbean is not some kind of proxy for a European struggle. It's more than that. And so in a moment I want to turn to the role of the Navy against enslavement revolt. But a lot of scholars have been keen in recent years to go back to thinking about this idea of liberation, to include the Navy in these kinds of considerations of the maritime world that I've been outlining, of a world that facilitates liberation for the enslaved. There's an excellent range of scholarship that in turn explains the role of the Navy as an employer of black crews, both afloat and ashore. Charles Foy and others have shown the scale of black crews in the 18th century Navy. And because naval records, if not necessarily naval officers, did not officially discriminate between races, only differentiating between ranks, and the fact that many of these men, including some very prominent individuals, found freedom through naval service, has meant that the Navy has been able to slot neatly into this narrative of a great liberator. whose sailors, like Linebarrow and Rediker's motley crews, display a multiracial, multinational consciousness. Even so, the Navy represents a paradox, because on the one hand, while there were instances like those I just described, to represent the Navy as a liberator, certainly before the age of suppression in the 19th century, really ignores the fact that naval personnel were also sometimes planters and enslavers, and that the Royal Navy was itself an instrument of the British state tasked with securing the enslaved economies of the Caribbean. Often it was concerned with external threats, but as I want to suggest now, it's critical in securing victories over internal threats in the form of enslaved uprisings. And it did it in four main ways. In the first place, the Navy was used to mobilize regular troops and munitions between islands and around islands, particularly where maritime routes were quicker and safer than those over land. Secondly, once there, naval vessels, particularly larger ones, operated as command centres and secure spaces for securing captured rebels. Thirdly, it provided protection from external threats, notably in the Windward Islands in the 1790s, where the Navy played a critical role in keeping French supplies and troops from reaching insurgent groups. And finally, as we'll see, the Navy was called upon to intervene directly in offensive action against the enslaved themselves. Some of these patterns were well established in the Caribbean before the 1790s. Amphibious operations had been widely employed in the region against French and Spanish and Dutch colonies. And during Tacky's Revolt in Jamaica in 1760, as Vincent Brown has shown, the Navy, in the form of the lively and the Port Antonio, was sent to offer relief on the northern coast. And I know that many people in this room and at home know far more about Tacky's Revolt than I do, not least because of the excellent workshop that Trevor hosted here about a year ago. But just as we now imagine the kind of maritime connections of Europeans, so too did the enslaved use the sea. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a Craskell and Simpson's very well-known map of Jamaica from 1763, so immediately after Tacky's Revolt. Isolated coves on the northern coast here, up in this area. So this is St. Mary's, where Tacky's Revolt broke out. And on this part of the coast here, there are a series of very small, secluded, isolated coves, from which the enslaved hoped to secure supplies and support from Saint Domingue, and perhaps as far away as Cuba. And the capacity of the Navy to be able to block the enslaved access to the sea was important, as Vincent Brown argued in his excellent book, in the swift suppression of Tacky's Revolt. And while we call the Great Jamaican Revolt of 1760 Tacky's Revolt, the event lasted only a matter of days and was really part of a much longer war against enslavement in Jamaica in 1760. Probably the more significant rising broke out in the west of the island, or in this part of the island here, and provided a much greater threat. One of its leaders was an enslaved man known by his African name as Hongo, but his enslaved name was Wager, perhaps named after HMS Wager, commanded by his owner, Captain Arthur Forrest. I think this is working again. So Forrest had served in the Caribbean in the 1740s and then returned and was redeployed, coincidentally perhaps, to Jamaica in the immediate aftermath of the revolt in 1760. And he owned something like 3,000 acres in Westmoreland, in the western part of the island. And he's important because he's far from alone, or what he represents is important because he's far from alone in being a senior naval officer and an enslaved. And it's useful, I think, amidst all of this sort of quite nice narrative about the Navy as a great liberator, to remember that for much of our period, planters and naval officers had a great deal in common. 3 decades later, so I'm going to jump a bit, the Navy's ability to mobilise troops and to restrict an enemy's access to the sea were employed against Saint-Domingue after 1793. The naval blockade of Saint-Domingue was as much about preventing revolution and revolutionaries from getting out as it was about preventing the French from accessing supplies. The Navy, like the rest of the British establishment, had no particular desire to see revolution spreading to Jamaica. But the extraordinary tumult created by the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the resumption of war between Britain and France in 1793 provided backdrop to the first other revolt on which I want to focus here. So I'm going to turn and talk about failure in Grenada. Grenada is situated, for those of you who don't know, in the southern part of the chain of islands that makes up the Windwards. And it's closely connected to the rest of the archipelago, which was made up of almost alternating French and British colonies. So we have two of the great European powers sitting cheek by jowl in colonies along this arc of the Caribbean. Now, Grenada was officially neutral, at least nominally, in the early part of the 18th century. And it was fought over by Britain and France in the second half of the century from bases in other parts of the Windwards. Seized by Britain in 1760, it was recaptured by the French in the 1780s before being returned to Britain. And its inhabitants were therefore, as a result of this constant shifting between British and French control, a kind of polyglot mix of French and British settlers and an enslaved population expanded probably with an intensity unprecedented even in the Caribbean. It was a tinderbox of disputes between enslaved and free, between black and white, French and British, Protestant and Catholic. And in the wake of the French and Haitian revolutions and the resumption of war, the island populations became increasingly fractious. Napoleon once famously characterized the struggle between Britain and France as a conflict between an elephant and a whale, where a great land power like France was operated in an entirely different sphere from a maritime giant like Britain. The Caribbean was one of the places where we could actually get at each other. So both sides sent huge forces to the Caribbean in the 1790s. Britain seized, let's see if I get the right button this time, Martinique and Guadeloupe from France in 1794, while France promptly recovered Guadeloupe and then began to use revolution as a weapon against the British colonies. And even before the rebellion in 1795, the Lieutenant Governor, Ninian Hugh, had been expecting an invasion attempt. What he didn't see coming was an enslaved uprising. And so it's in this kind of context then that Julien Frédon, a free man of colour, organised and began a rebellion against the British in Grenada on the 2nd of March 1795. While for him and for the white French inhabitants, this was partly about their rights as free citizens and partly about the opportunity to give Britain a good whacking. But for the enslaved who flocked to the rebellion, this was about self-liberation. Within about a fortnight of the revolt beginning, the British president of the Grenada Council estimated that some 4,000 enslaved people were involved, compared to only about 350 free people of colour. The revolt, of course, was actively encouraged by French revolutionary forces elsewhere in the archipelago, particularly up here based in Guadeloupe. The kind of particular circumstances of the 1790s forged an alliance between the enslaved seeking self-liberation and French revolutionary fervour. And given the kind of connections along the archipelago in the way that I was describing earlier on, the enslaved in Grenada almost certainly knew that the French had emancipated slaves in Guadeloupe in 1794, and felt that an alliance with Faidal would bring a similar result for them. And so I think there's possibly an argument that Guadeloupe offers as influential an exemplar to the enslaved of Grenada as did the Haitian Revolution to the northwest. Now, I'm not going to dig into the revolt too deeply here. I think it's enough to say that for a time in 1795, all but the island capital was under insurgent control, and it took the deployment of regular British forces more than a year to regain order. What I want to do instead is to focus in on some of the maritime aspects. But Grenada, this is depicted around about 1780. Grenada is one of those islands where it's often quicker and safer to travel by sea around the island than it is to try to traverse the mountains interior. The sea, of course, was also the principal means by which rebels secured support from places like Guadeloupe. So for the British, to be able to move troops quickly and safely was imperative, as was being able effectively to blockade their own colony to keep the French out and the rebels in. So in March 1795, the rebels seized La Bay, which the British called Granville Bay, and Guave, or Charlottetown as the British called it. And then the two forces moved inland to Belvedere, where Faidal had his base. So in effect, they cut off the northern part of the island from the British. As well as cutting off the British from the northern half of the island, they also retained, by having all of this coastline, continued access to the sea and therefore continued access to allies in French colonies to the north. At first, the British thought it was an invasion, but when they understood it to be an uprising, an internal uprising, they dispatched troops by ships to Guave, which were soon reinforced by 50 Marines from HMS Quebec. And this pattern of using the Navy to move troops quickly was maintained. By March the 15th, reinforcements under General Colin Lindsay arrived and were landed at Charlottetown, where they marched to Faidal's quarters. Now, his advance was marked by a whole series of delays. Not least was that Lindsay probably suffered what we would now call acute anxiety, and a week into the campaign, marked by a series of frustrations, he took his own life. Shortly before he died, however, he noted the importance of the Navy as more than just a troop transport. He wrote, "I rely upon the Navy that they will prevent supplies from getting to the enemy from Guadeloupe or elsewhere." And his concerns were well founded. Small vessels, as I've been suggesting, sailed regularly between the two islands, and it took naval intervention to stop them. In late March 1795, HMS Resource captured two vessels. One on the 22nd, going to Grenada with, and as the logbook records, shot and powder for the rebels, and another on the 26th of March, sailing from Grenada and crewed by French residents carrying emissaries to Guadeloupe. According to Kenneth Francis Mackenzie, the embattled president of the Grenada Council, these emissaries intended to buy munitions for the rebel forces. So these two incidents demonstrate the importance of maritime aspects of the revolt, both for the rebels relying on connections to the outside world, and for the British in trying to constrain them. It's clear, I think, that the Navy faced a constant struggle to restrict these kinds of communications. The French frigate Superb was intercepted by the Vanguard, and in October, HMS Mermaid was cruising off the east coast of the island when it came across two French vessels off La Bay here. The French, on seeing the British ship turning up, quickly set sail for the south, but the smaller vessel, Brutus, was discovered in Requin, or what the British called Requiem Bay, here, just a little bit further south from where they were initially spotted. By the time the Mermaid got to it, some 170 French troops and crew had been disembarked from the Brutus. Some, even as the Mermaid sailed into the harbour, and you can just about see, at least, I don't know if you can just about see, hopefully you can see. So this is the Mermaid here, and this is the small French vessel Brutus. And you can just about see here, there's a kind of anchor line down which French troops and crew are disembarking as rapidly as they can, with the Mermaid hoving into view. The larger vessel, the frigate the Republican, was spotted again a few days later and was captured with a French general and over 200 men on board. So these incidents indicate, I think, how important maritime access to support was for the rebels, and tells us something about the extent of the support they expected, as well as how critical the Navy's capacity to intercede might be. The capture of the Brutus and the Mermaid, the Brutus and the Republican gained coverage in Britain, both in images and in newspapers. But, as the Morning Chronicle noted, when the Mermaid returned to St George with the captured vessels, the captain and crew discovered that the port on the other side of the island, Lake Gouaz, had been recaptured. So just as the Navy played a critical role in suppressing revolt, an understrength Navy risked revolts being successful. And the government, the British government back in London, were making calculations about these things. And the British were actively considering whether it was worth losing some possessions to retain others. So in January 1796, while all this stuff is still going on, Earl Spencer, the first Lord of the Admiralty, wrote to Henry Dundas, that kind of great political fixer of the 1790s. And he wrote supporting an attack on Saint-Domingue by the British, even though it risked, and I quote, most, if not all, of our islands to the windward. He went on, we must, therefore, make up our minds to the probable loss of all our leeward island dominions and be prepared to stage the probable acquisition of Saint-Domingue and the consequent security of Jamaica as a sufficient equivalent for that loss. So the British are making some really, or at least are considering, some really quite significant re-engineering of their empire in the Caribbean. Now, in the end, the Southern Caribbean was not sacrificed, and resources were deployed in much, much greater volumes to suppress the rebellion. In all, perhaps 7,000 enslaved people died during the rebellion, along with hundreds of free people of colour and whites. The rebellion, which came as close as any to actually overthrowing British rule in the Caribbean, was estimated to have caused £2.5 million sterling's worth of damage. These calculations are always a bit shaky, but that's somewhere in the order of £250 million. Rebuilding the island and the estates took years thereafter. After this, Grenada was not seriously threatened by full-scale revolt by the enslaved. In Jamaica, however, and indeed elsewhere, the risk of insurgency among the enslaved remained. As I want now to turn to the Jamaican Rebellion. A few days before Christmas 1831, a widespread labour dispute broke out at Salt Spring Estate in St Elizabeth Parish in northern Jamaica. The strike action by enslaved workers, planned through Baptist networks and led by Samuel Sharp, quickly turned violent. On December the 27th, the Kensington estate, high in the hills above Montego Bay, was torched. When dispatches reached the governor, he immediately called out the militia, but he also sent 2 armed vessels to harbours at Montego Bay and Black River, while a detachment of regular troops were readied aboard HMS Sparrowhawk in Port Royal Harbour. In the interim, by the 29th of December, news of widespread estate burning across the northern parishes arrived in Spanish Town. And in its brutal suppression of the Jamaican Rebellion, the British continued to send in regular troops and continued to deploy the Navy. The advantage for Jamaica, of course, course, unlike Grenada, which had no permanent naval establishment, Jamaica was home to a major naval squadron at Port Royal. And in confronting the rebellion, the Navy was used as more than just a key part of the logistical operations. It was also used as an offensive force against the enslaved. The Sparrowhawk carried 2 companies of soldiers under the command of Willoughby Cotton to Montego Bay on December the 30th. The next day, HMS Blanche, a 46-gun ship under Arthur Farquhar, was loaded with ordnance, stores, and 355 troops at Port Royal, and it sailed for Montego Bay. The Navy quickly encircled the island. At least 8 vessels were sent to ports around the island, taking troops and ordnance to the immediate locus of trouble at Montego Bay and Great River, but also to Falmouth and to Lucia on the north coast, to Black River and Savannah Lamar in the south, and to Port Antonio in the far east of the island. So this image is based on James Robertson's very well-known 1804 map of the island of Jamaica. And what I've tried to indicate here, I don't know how clear it is for you at the back, are the red dots are the ports where the Navy sent ships. So you can get a sense that the Navy is encircling the entire island. It's not leaving, it's trying not to leave any spaces for the enslaved to maintain communications with other parts of the Caribbean. The blue dots are beginning. They're not all of the estates, but these are some of the major estates that rose up against their enslaved owners in 1831 and 32. So you get a sense of the scale of this uprising. So by the beginning of January, it was pretty clear that this was not a rising that was going to be easily contained. The burning of Kensington in late December and the other hilltop estates acted as kind of beacons to the enslaved across the parishes of St. James, Hanover, St. Elizabeth, and Trelawney. Enslaved forces carefully organised, including a well-armed 150-strong regiment that they called the Black Regiment, led by Colonel Johnson of the Retrieve estate, pushed the planter militias backwards on land and gained control of large swathes of the Jamaican interior. In all, perhaps 60,000 enslaved people rose up as part of this rebellion. But what of the Navy? How does the Navy deal with these internal revolts? The kind of amphibious assaults depicted here in James Fuller Boxer's watercolour have been widely employed by the British across the Caribbean and across the 18th century. Faced with a serious internal military threat from the enslaved, this kind of revolt, this kind of activity was used against the rebels themselves. It's clear from the logbooks of the Blanche that the main and the largest of the naval vessels deployed against the enslaved, that the crew and marines actively prepared for just such an eventuality, even if they didn't know precisely against whom they might be deployed. In late 1830, for example, a year before the Jamaican Rebellion, but when at a time when there was little serious prospect of war between European rivals, sailors on the Blanche practiced drills with cutter crews, they trained men in small arms attacks, and they readied gun crews while they were on patrol around Caribbean waters. And the importance of exactly this kind of training that they were undertaking well over a year before this event emerged is apparent from the way that they were deployed, as depicted here in Boxer's painting. So after troops and ammunition were unloaded from the Blanche at Montego Bay, which was their initial task, the ship moved to the western side of Montego Bay itself on the 3rd of January. And the captain's logbook notes that the first attack took place there later that day, when 5 boats as you can see in the image, were sent ashore. This initial incursion went badly, and some 3 hours later, as the logbook records, observing the party on shore to be warmly attacked, sent more ammunition and assistance. Now this was evidently more successful, as the boats returned with prisoners shortly afterwards. It took the Navy at least 2 days to quell the attacks on the Bog Estates, which you can see depicted towards the shoreline in this painting. But even after that, considerable nervousness remained amongst the naval contingent. They sent a party of Marines and sailors ashore every evening until early February, long after the rebellion is usually regarded to be finished. And a kind of discernible pattern emerges. The boats went ashore in late afternoon, and they returned at first light the next morning. Farquhar and his officers were clearly concerned about the threat of the rebels returning under cover of darkness. By early February, the danger from this particular quarter had passed. Across the island, the British crushed the revolt with their customary brutality, and the Blanche returned to Port Royal on the 8th of February. Before it did so, however, it's likely that some 72 enslaved people were killed here in this location, along with another 260 captured. Now, officially, 207 enslaved people were killed in the rebellion, with another 312 executed after courts-martial. So either this confrontation was especially violent and accounted for about a third of all the combat deaths for the enslaved across the whole of the rebellion, or, as Mary Record argues a long time ago, the official toll seriously underestimates the numbers of people who lost their lives. In many ways, these two risings that I've been describing were really rather different. One was admired with the French Revolution and rights for free French people, while the other much more closely resembles a kind of classic self-liberation struggle by the enslaved. In one other key respect, though, the Jamaican Rebellion was different. Unlike all the other slave revolts, this one took place when the abolition of slavery seemed imminent on a wave of widespread public and political support. So crushing slave revolts in the 1760s, when almost nobody in Europe seriously imagined the end of enslavement, or during the war with France in the 1790s, seemed to prevent few moral dilemmas for naval personnel. But in this last section, what I want to try to do is to begin to think about how the abolitionist context shaped responses to enslaved revolt. Now, I ought to add that this bit is a little bit speculative. I had hoped to have done significantly more archival research. Like everybody else, I'm blaming COVID. And so what I want to try and do is to present this as a kind of set of future directions, and perhaps get your responses, rather than as some kind of carefully considered reflection on years' worth of detailed scholarship. In 1831-1832, as before, the Navy acted as an instrument of the British state. So the fact that it was involved in suppressing rebellions is unsurprising. But at the same time, as it essentially supported the maintenance of enslavement, it was also trying to suppress the trafficking of enslaved Africans off the coast of West Africa and in the Caribbean. Now, one might argue, as people had done in 1807, that preventing the trafficking of Africans did not preclude the continuation of slavery, although those kind of conceptual contortions were much harder to sustain in the early 1830s. Even so, at exactly the same time as the Blanche-led attacks in support of enslavement in Jamaica, the famous threesome of the Dryad, the Fair Rosamond, and the Black Joke, here in an earlier confrontation in 1829, were on patrol off West Africa. The Black Joke, which is the vessel on the left here, captured its final slave ship exactly 1 week after the blacks had returned to Montego Bay. The Sparrowhawk, which, as I've suggested, was key to the initial response to the Jamaican Rebellion, had already been part of the suppression of the slave trade in the Caribbean itself, and captured the Spanish ship, the Santiago, off Cuba in 1830. So in this way, from a kind of anti-slavery perspective, the Navy found itself occupying deeply contradictory positions in a way that mirrors its kind of paradoxical relationship to enslavement more generally. Now, for an instrument of the state to adopt inconsistent positions may not seem altogether surprising. But I'm interested here in how the personnel responded, rather than the institution. We know from Mary Wills's work that among naval crews were many abolitionists by the 1830s, in a marked shift, say, from the 1760s. Men like Claude Henry Mason Buckland, who served in the patrols in the 1820s and then captained HMS Growler off West Africa in the 1840s, was a deeply religious man who was staunchly opposed to slavery. Captain Charles Phillips, who advocated the use of free labour in the 1820s, captured slave traders in 1822. And it's not just officers. Men from the ranks also drew attention in their roles in the anti-slavery squadron. Men like Whaley Armitage, who became known for his action against the Wakina and the Manalita, or Samuel Otway Woolridge, who gained a commission for his role in liberating 422 Africans in 1836. Now, the reason I mention these individuals is that they were all in the Jamaica squadron at the time of the rebellion. Armitage was a mate on the Sparrowhawk, sent to Montego Bay as soon as the rebellion broke out. Woolridge served under Phillips in the Ariadne off Montego Bay, while Buckle, then a lieutenant, was aboard the North Star in Jamaica in January 1832. So these men, who clearly saw themselves as abolitionists and prided themselves on their role in the anti-slavery squadrons, also took active parts, however they may have felt privately, in securing slavery in Jamaica. We know from scholars like Charlie Floyd that the crews of naval vessels in Caribbean waters were also multiracial. Dozens of the men aboard these naval vessels are likely to have been of African origin. Some, particularly in the 1760s and the 1790s, were likely to have been enslaved. Now, it ought to be possible to identify some of these men through muster books and pay books when getting to archives as opened up again. But what I'm suggesting here, I think, is that although we can see changing attitudes to enslavement amongst naval personnel over the so-called age of abolition. So by the 1830s, officers were far more likely to identify as abolitionists than as planters. This seems not to have affected how the Navy responded to enslavement itself, nor, importantly, to the challenges to the practice of enslavement by the enslaved. Okay, let me try and pull some of this together. So in the first place, I want to suggest that our understandings of enslaved revolt are more nuanced by thinking about their maritime contexts, both for the enslaved, whose representatives used long-established navigable sea routes to maintain ties to other islands, and so drew in ideas and weapons to their own struggles, and for the enslavers, who were able to deploy the Royal Navy in their defence. The Navy's particular role in suppressing revolts, I think, is more significant than is sometimes understood. Without naval power, the British would not have had the capacity to move men and weapons, or effectively to deny the rebels access to communication, or access to supplies and to allies. Nor would they have been able to launch amphibious assaults on rebel positions directly, which, as I've suggested, were important in the British response to suppressing enslaved uprisings. And in a sense, if we kind of play the counterfactual, factual game. If we look at the Haitian Revolution, One of the reasons that the French found it difficult, amidst a welter of other explanations, I realise, but the French had ceded control over the seas to the British. And that made it extremely difficult for them either to bring in supplies and support to try to put down the Haitian Revolution. But it also ultimately meant that the French, later under Rochambeau, had no way of escaping the island when they're being pushed back by Dessalines' forces. So what I'm suggesting then is that this kind of naval barrier that the British were able to put up was instrumental in their ability to crush revolts. And finally, I think the other thing, the last thing that I'm suggesting here is that all of this challenges assumptions that some historians quite like to me, and you can see why this is attractive for naval historians to say the Navy is a great liberator. It's pretty clear that the Navy's essential attitude to enslavement was not primarily to act as a liberator. What all this confirms, I think, is that the Navy was an instrument of the British state tasked with securing the enslaved colonies, even as public attitudes and some attitudes amongst its own personnel had turned clearly against enslavement. Thank you very much for listening.